these guys over here were building some interesting tech things, and so I ended up coming up to station to help out, and I'll talk about that in a bit.
Hey everybody, my name is Jeff Reichman. I run a nonprofit called Sketch City, which is a community of tech and data nerds. And we all kind of looked up after the rain had stopped and said, is everybody okay? And since we were all having that conversation anyway, we got started working on stuff.
Hi everyone, my name is Gaurav Khandelwal. I'm the founder CEO of Chai One. We are a digital innovation agency. We work with Fortune 500 oil and gas and utilities companies, building out really cool applications, whether it's mobile, voice, or cloud.
My name is Matt. I'm with Poetic Systems. We do similar stuff to what Gaurav's company does. And yeah, same situation as what Jeff was mentioning. We were high and dry and just at the last moment said, we got to do something. So that's how we got involved.
So as the storm was hitting, what was the first problem that you identified, and what was your approach to solving it? Michael, let's start with you.
Once the storm hit?
Yeah, as the storm was hitting.
Yeah, so again, I was out doing boat rescues, and what was one of the interesting things is, and I'm sure everyone's at this point sort of heard the story, that it was sort of chaos. We didn't know where to go, who to help, et cetera. And so I started to discover these tools, and I had no idea that I knew that many of the people sitting up here were the ones doing it, and I knew them ahead of time. And I ended up coming up into the office. I don't write a line of code, but what I could do was provide some free software for people, try to find resources for people. And I started to also realize probably the most important thing was trying to figure out a way to market the tools that they were developing, because there were multiple sites out there, and so I really focused on how to interact potentially with the city and other agencies.
Yeah, well, when we kind of were looking around and saying, well, what should we do? A couple of teams started on a rescue map, and Matthew Marchetti and Crowdsource Rescue, formerly Houston Harvey Rescue, really was on top of that. And so his map had launched at that point, and people were using it, and it was really effective. So a lot of us looked at that and said, okay, what's next? What should we focus on? And so at that point, people were starting to move into shelters. They were being rescued. They needed to go somewhere. And a lot of us had volunteered at the George R. Brown and said, hey, there's a lot of problems here. Maybe we can do some stuff. And so people like Amanda Shee and Neeraj Tandon and so many other folks started prototyping apps. Niall Dixon built a shelter text bot. And it just started coming from there. Once we started pushing things out there, more people started showing up and more people started kind of figuring out their niche and what they wanted to go build, and it grew into something citywide. It was really awesome.
Yeah, I saw both of you guys, Grace and Jeff on Facebook Live, and Michael here at Station talking about this effort, and that was the spark. And then we found that several of our devs were already helping as part of Sketch City, Nathan Ayer and several others. So we showed up here on that Saturday. And then, we've had several ideas, one of which was just to find a way to connect people with needs, with people that have a certain need. We saw people here manually connecting folks on the phone with people that needed shelters, people that needed things. It just seemed really inefficient. And then I had some personal stuff, but I'm sure we'll go over that in some other questions.
What was the biggest problem that you saw, and what was your approach to tackle it?
Okay, so the initial problem that we saw was just people stuck in their houses. And so I hang out with a lot of rednecks, so we got boats and trucks and all that kind of stuff together over in Spring Branch. We were right next to kind of where the reservoirs are. So we sat around and said, how do we get involved? There was this really confusing thing at first. Like, is it illegal to just drive a boat into a neighborhood? Are there going to be police officers? So we got 2 Jeeps, 2 trucks, 2 boats, took off, found a neighborhood. There was nobody there, so we just put the boat in and just went and found people, and nobody got in trouble. So I said that was an initial problem. After a couple of days of that, it became a competition to see who could actually get their boat into the water. There were so many people. It was kind of amazing to see the response, and we were getting turned away. So we switched over came up here, and by that time, everybody here was already hard and fast at work, so we were able to just get plugged in where they already saw the need.
So I want to go with this idea of the information gap Elena had asked during the previous panel. One of the reasons why I got involved with Harvey was that, like like many of the people here, I was high and dry. We are a block from station, and we had access to the internet and to uninterrupted electricity, and trying to find where is that one point of truth, right? That where people can find accurate and timely information. And a lot of people who were on Twitter and Facebook were either reporting old inaccurate information because maybe a shelter had closed, or maybe a shelter wasn't accepting people anymore, or they didn't know whether something like a reservoir was going to be opened or not, whether they should evacuate or not. So I put together a Twitter list of all of the different agencies and the different government officials that were reporting what was happening, whether there was a curfew or not, and so on. And then started collecting everything into one page on Station Houston's site, which some of that data migrated into some of the tools that these gentlemen worked on. So I'm wondering, what did you see as the biggest point of information, that gap or that lack of knowledge that need to be shared? And what was the biggest pain point?
Well, there were a lot of pain points. There were a lot of problems. We made a lot of mistakes. Probably in broadest strokes, I think that there's stuff that, we've talked about this before, there's stuff that government can do and there's stuff that government can't do. Government can't encourage peer-to-peer rescues. Government can't assume liability for crazy stuff, like pulling people off of second stories of homes. So when we're building technology to help facilitate rescues and shelters and crowdsourced information, it's stuff that's done alongside of government. And so there's this whole category of disaster technology that government, you can't really look to them to do.
Why not?
Like peer-to-peer needs matching, or
Why can't the government help in that area?
there's a lot of liability associated with that. So like crisis cleanup, for example, is coordinated through VOAD, which is a coalition of volunteer organizations that activate in disasters. I think that additionally, government is already doing so much, just keeping the doors open and the lights on.
People.
Yeah, and operating to the best of their capacity, 24/7 all the time. The problem is just way too huge. So, in terms of data and how to kind of address needs throughout a disaster, whether it's rescue needs or relief needs or recovery needs, there's a lot of crowdsourcing that happens now, and it's incumbent upon organizations outside of the government to help manage that and report it back and create a total picture of what's out there.
Do either of you?
I think, to kind of echo that as well, I saw a bifurcation in all the different projects that were going on, and certain people were creating platforms to assist with the government, and certain people were creating these peer-to-peer platforms. So for an example, I believe the project you were working on was peer-to-peer. I have a need, I can help you with that, or I need rescue, all that kind of stuff. And I think that's great because the government takes a while to respond. I don't think that if something bad happens immediately to the scale that it did happen, there's approvals and things, and we have to get money and we have to do all this stuff. So it's like the disaster goes through these different phases. There's this initial phase of, well, there's just people drowning everywhere. How do we get them out of the water? And that's where these citizen apps, that's where these peer-to-peer apps are very, very useful. And then 3, 4, 5, 6 days in, we start having rumor mill spinning information. There's a plant that's going to blow up, or it's not going to blow up, or the water's got E. coli in it, or whatever. And then there's like rumors. And that's where the government really starts getting very helpful in rumor control, stopping the spin, and that's kind of where we got more involved, was with building a platform to help the government. What we're trying to do is build a platform to allow the government to officially communicate through official channels, and then to coordinate people to meet with these intermediary agencies. And that's kind of the last thing. The government generally works through nonprofits. So they would collect lots of resources together and then distribute those out into the communities through the nonprofits, who take care of vetting the individuals to make sure that if somebody needs some diapers, that they don't get on a peer-to-peer platform and some weirdo is like, hey, I can provide diapers for you, let's meet at the 7-Eleven, but more that they can give all the diapers to the church in the community, and then the people who need those resources can go to the church in the community. So I think that to sum it all up, we need 2 major unified solutions: one peer-to-peer solution, one government solution.
But the one problem that we also discovered after rescue was that when you go to answer the question, what's the proper way to do mucking, or what's the proper way to handle XYZ? Do you go to the city, the county, the state, federal, which federal agency? And so that was the other big problem, and that, you could almost say that, the well-educated were able to solve a lot of their problems. The medium-educated there too, but if you're the lower spectrum, you are really going to struggle to find authoritative answers and resources, and that was one of the big issues that I saw.
How did you approach that? I know you were working on the knowledge base, was one of your passion projects.
So one of the things, the original idea was, let's create a knowledge base. Let's take the best-in-class articles, et cetera, best-in-class resources from the different governmental agencies. And in some cases, the best was at the city level, in some cases at the federal level. But let's really make it simple. And then we realized that the big problem there is you have to know the right question to ask. Because we were starting to hear that from social workers and others that they would speak to someone on the phone, and the person would say, I need food. And they'd ask one more question like, by the way, where are you? I'm in my house. Did you have water in your house? Yes. You should get out of your house. So what we started to realize is what you also needed on the front end. So if you're well educated, you know how to use Google, right? If maybe you're not technically savvy or you don't have access, what if you could have an ingest survey, or a survey that basically profiled the needs of the person and asked them the questions that they didn't think to ask themselves, and then serve them the information?
There's something else also along those lines is when we looked at all of the stuff that was going on, it seemed like the distinction between what you see with Skype, Skype's a really full-featured piece of software. You've got video, you've got screen sharing, you've got audio, you've got file sharing, all of this stuff. Well, it also requires people to understand how this thing works, to go over the intricacies or whatever. And then you have WhatsApp, and they started with just something very, very basic, which is just chat. And then added, video now and audio and all this kind of stuff later. So for us, building a platform, we figured, what could we do that would just be dirt, stupid, simple, that anybody without an education could just download. No need for social media accounts, no need for authentication, no need for email logins, none of that stuff. You just download the app, you put your phone number, everybody's got a phone number, because otherwise you won't have people download the app. You have an address, and that's it. That's all you need. And start with that. And then we can add stuff to that later. One of the most important considerations for us was localization from a language perspective. So we wanted to launch the app with Spanish and English in it from the get-go. And we figured if we can get it to work with just that much features, then we can think about scaling it from there.
Can you talk a little bit more about that? So I think one of the biggest challenge for Houston, being the most diverse city in the world, in the country, and one of the largest in the country, it was really hard to get resources and source needs from these other communities, right? So maybe they were communities that didn't have access, whether it was to the internet or by streets. Did you guys find any ways that people were overcoming those challenges? Challenges of access?
So we had people when we released the app, the first version was an Android. And so we got that out there, and we used HCC, Community College, to mail that app to the entire database. And that's where we got the most uptake. So those were college-educated students or people that had gone to community colleges that spoke Spanish. And they released the iOS version whenever it got approved, like a week later. So I can't speak specifically to the addresses and that stuff, but we saw that Spanish uptake coming mostly from the HCC email blast.
And for us, I think that there were a lot of questions. It's a common question when you're looking at the equity of something, whether or not people without technology access can use whatever you've built. And that's a hard question to answer when you're building tech tools in a disaster. But what we found was the tools that we built were able to be used on mobile phones and on iPads, and people would help other people at shelters. So you'd have volunteers pulling up the muck map saying, as you're leaving the shelter, let me drop a pin for you and help you through this. So one way or the other, everybody, I shouldn't say everybody, but most people had access to somebody near them that could help them with their technology literacy if they didn't have it themselves.
Mm-hmm. That seems like a recurring theme, this idea of empowering neighbors to help neighbors, right? So that was a common theme throughout Harvey Rescue and Relief, that you had people who were volunteering, you had lines of volunteers outside of the shelters turning people away because there were too many volunteers. So what do you think some of the thoughts, whether they're challenges or challenges to the city itself, or challenges to organizations, or challenges to the communities of Houston, to empowering people to help their neighbors?
So I can share my personal story. So my wife offered up our house to someone on Facebook that said they needed a place for 6 nurses to stay, and we didn't know these people, and they showed up a day before they were supposed to show up, and then they came from Portland, Oregon, Ohio, Arizona, and it was just some through an organization called GoDocs, which we'd never heard of. So they showed up ready to help. They go to NRG Park and they get turned back the first day. They go again the next morning, they get turned back. They go that night, they get turned back. And I'm like, what's going on? Why are you guys hanging out in my living room? You should be out there helping people. And they're like, we really want to help people, except we can't. Like, everybody's turning us away because they have too many nurses. I was like, what do you mean? So we get on Facebook, we start talking to our friends, our family, and whatnot. We find people in Conroe, we find people in East Houston that don't have access to internet or don't have access to a way to get to a shelter, that are struggling and in need. So we were finding that people were using social media and text messages as a way, you talk about government, to just help each other, whether they're software or not. Between Facebook, Messenger, WhatsApp, text messaging, and others, people already were organically helping each other. It was just really chaotic. So, so that's where you have people showing up at a shelter and then getting turned away, or standing in line for 3 hours to donate their time, then being turned away. We saw a lot of that. So I don't know if there's another way of solving that, but these organizations that come into town, they need like a go-to place that then directs them to different areas, to help. And I think that's kind of where, the different relief organizations and SCED City and others can help.
Mm-hmm. So being able to organize people, that's a challenge that needs to be solved. Is that correct?
Especially people that are coming in from out of town,
Mm-hmm.
because they're just showing up because they're being funded by whoever, but then they have no idea where to go.
Mm-hmm. So thinking of how you approach the problems that you're trying to solve and the solutions you created, what would you do differently for next time?
I would say that the biggest challenge that we face and still face is that I don't believe that I don't believe there's been a concerted effort to just take a step back, do a design thinking round on this thing, and build a strategic plan that could then be shared with the whole community on with user stories and with a plan on what actually needs to happen. We have lots of these. There's a panel right before us that also talked about this, and I think in order to truly solve the problems, we need to collect all the problems together, and we almost need to build like a 20, 30 page long, full retrospective on what happened, with user stories, with real people in it, with the value of solving each of the individual problems that could then be circulated amongst the community, and then maybe link to some of the concerted efforts that are going on to solve those problems.
Yeah, I agree 100% with that, and I think that technology is the last to kind of get informed on the strategy, because it's got to be reactive to what the nonprofits are thinking about, or what the government agencies are thinking about, or whatnot. Everybody's kind of trying to reconcile their experience now, and we get to get the tail end of that. So hopefully everybody else will kind of figure out what's necessary in their strategic plan, and we can come in and start filling those gaps with real user stories and some practical experience that we all kind of honed through the disaster.
I think one of the questions, so I agree with that assessment. The question becomes, how do you fund it? How do people take time away from their jobs or time from the families to come and spend the time to write the user stories in anticipation of the next disaster? That might be next year, or might not be there for another 5 years. And then how do you turn this into something that's a global platform that can be used by communities around the world?
Everything that these guys said, but I think the other thing I would add is that it was supremely frustrating to see the same people working on the same stuff, and or city not coordinated with county, or county not coordinated with Red Cross, or Red Cross not. That there's all these different groups and stakeholders, and it would be really great if there's one single point of entry where one, as a civilian, when you're stressed out and you need help, that don't make me think. Let me come to one site that everyone promotes, and then it gets routed to the United Way, it gets routed to the county, or it gets routed to the city and to these various tools. But until we solve that problem, we're still going to have kind of a free-for-all where no one knows where to go when they need help.
And before I open up the floor to questions from the audience, can you share at least one solution that you created or one solution that you saw somebody create that gives you hope that you think should continue to be worked on, or a process, like whether it's organizing people, finding a way to organize people, or finding a way to channel people into things that you think that we should continue to work on. So a tool and or process.
Well, aside from what these gentlemen up here have built, I think the Harvey API has a lot of merit. I think that...
Can you talk about the Harvey API?
Sure. It's basically like when Google Sheets breaks for you, the Harvey API steps in. What we really tried to focus on was build whatever front end makes sense for you, but all come from the same data source. So about, I guess, 15 people or so contributed to this Harvey API that allows you to crowdsource information, but also have a governance process to make sure that somebody doesn't come in and delete the whole sheet, or somebody doesn't start messing up your data. So there's this pretty nifty tool that suddenly was cloned and stood up for Irma, and they configured it for all sorts of other needs. Matthew over here and his team built a really cool front end that you can just stand up like that. And frankly, the Disaster Connect app is something that we need to have running all the time so that it can ramp up when a disaster strikes. So I think that there's a lot of merit to a lot of this technology, and some of it was temporary technology, like the muck map that Kelly was talking about. It lasted for 3 days, and then we migrated into crisis cleanup. So I do think that there are a lot of these applications that merit further development and kind of long-term, year-round investment of at least time, if not dollars.
So the API is the tool. Is there a process?
Yeah, the process that I would say is I was really fortunate to be able to work in the Emergency Operations Center for a while and work alongside VOAD and the official relief effort from the city. So I was able to see a lot of what was going on. Some others of us were there as well. And I think working closely, having tech nerds working closely with VOAD makes a whole lot of sense, and it doesn't happen very often. So it requires a lot of trust to be built up over time. I would love to see that somehow codified and cloned whenever there's a disaster. You have local tech people who are working alongside the local response effort and coordinating in this kind of ongoing feedback loop.
So I think that there's, as a matter of process, there's also the idea of marketing. So we built some really cool tools. What we don't want is for them just to die. And, we all have our day jobs and our day businesses or whatever. But there's got to be a platform that allows us to then spread this technology that we've built globally so that it's not being used post-disaster. So what I'm noticing, or at least what we've seen, is that whenever there's a disaster somewhere in the world, a local group of developers comes together and builds some platform that lasts about 3 to 4 weeks, and then everybody goes back to their jobs or kind of dies. And so that's kind of like if you just plot that, you would see the bigger the disaster, the more number of tools that pop open, and then they all die. So we started with Chennai, with Italy, and we had a bunch of these people on Slack, with us. So I think the real question is, how do we make it sustainable? How do we make it something that does not need to be ramped up and shut down every time there is something? Is it possible to build the Facebook of disasters, where relief organizations, community members, people can be registered and be there ready, blood types, whatever is needed at a moment's notice? So, this forest fire coming, don't worry about it, it's there. You already have a, disaster ID on your phone, and that has all your key elements, in there. People can get access to it. They know where to find you, so that this chaos kind of goes away.
Does that exist?
It doesn't exist. It's a huge opportunity.
I definitely agree with that, and I think even everything that we've built so far, until we actually take a step back and build a strategy, is a guess of what needs to go forward, which is why I've echoed a few times concerns that I think that now that big parts of the disaster are past and it's X time till the next one happens, that we should almost pause or put a pin in all the things that have been done, then we really need to get all the stakeholders involved in having a round table or a meeting of the minds, get the people from VOAD, get the previous speakers, get the people from the city, get them all together, collect all the user stories and say, if this were to happen again, what would be the ultimate solution to this? Because to solve what Gaurav's saying about a singular, like a Facebook that stood up, first off, if the thing even has to be deployed in the first place, you've already introduced such a big hurdle that it may not happen. The reason why everybody used the first initial temporary system in Zello, which was a horrible, I'm glad it was there, but it was a horrible interface, was just because it worked, because you could hit download on App Store and launch it. Sure, there's better systems that we know about that Jeff's told me a million times that are open source that we can spin up, but who's going to spin it up whenever we've got a bunch of people that know how to drive boats? So I wholeheartedly agree that a Facebook of disaster platforms needs to be built, but in order to know what to build there, we need to go build the strategic plan.
So I think the good news is I think there are a lot of different groups trying to come together to try to solve this. Will it be solved? I don't know. But what I do know is that if this spun up again, if another hurricane hits in a month or 2 years from now, what will happen is these same tools will be spun up, but I think this time around they'll be iterated more. So there was, for example, you could text a 5-digit number to tell you the nearest shelter. Well, we don't need to develop that again. That's already been built. So those same people might now do, where's the nearest kidney dialysis center for people who are displaced? And I think you'll see an evolution of it. That's kind of the nature of this sort of open source situation. In fact, I had a comment with someone at the city where I said, if the city and the county and the agencies don't all come together and solve this organic sort of open source volunteer effort will continue and it'll keep building upon it. It's just a question of how fast and how much. So there are, again, some good efforts that haven't been I'm not sure how publicly disclosed they are yet, but some efforts to try to bring to bear all the different resources we have in the city and financially and entities to try to help orchestrate this a bit more.
Sorry, my mic died. So a strategic plan or a strategic planning session towards a plan, making it sustainable and making it possible for people who want to work on these projects to make it their life, right? Because if you're going to spend so much time on it, they need to get compensated in some way for it. And then some kind of system for the city to work with volunteers. Does that cover it, those three pieces?
Marketing.
And marketing. Okay, thank you. And marketing. So that's some food for thought. Does the audience have any questions? I'd like to open it up now. Yes.
Yeah, so one thing that really interested me during this was Airbnb. I was at my church volunteering, and somebody came up and said, "I need a place to live for a couple weeks." That's kind of almost a crazy, dangerous question because all sorts of people will come up, and it was very relieving to say you can go to the most powerful peer-to-peer housing provision network that there is. Can you speak on the difference between making your own system versus calling up Uber when you had to get boats from A to B and calling them up and saying, "Can you build this tool?"
So I actually reached out to the CTO at Uber, who I used to work with, and I asked Tuan this exact question. Is there some way to use it? And basically there's no way the software is built just for them, right? But the interesting thing is that Silicon Valley, Zendesk, Qualtrics, AWS, they were all lunging forward to try to help out. So where it was possible to grab software off the shelf, we could grab it. And in the future, that's the other thing I would love to see us create is a inventory of companies want to donate their services to software as well as services to developers or to anyone else or to the city for that matter. But the hard problem is even for the city or any public entity, it's hard for them to adopt and absorb that free offer. Now, for the case of developers here, great, give me all the AWS and Twilio credits I can get. Great. So I don't know if that fully answered it.
Yeah, I think that big companies want to help, but it's not a crisis for them, but it is a crisis for the people here. And keep in mind that even though it seems like there are disasters happening everywhere, this is an edge case in software. This is not something that you go to Station Houston saying, I'm doing a disaster startup, because it's really fragmented and it's really, it's only used for a very finite window of time, but it's so important during that window of time that I think that this is kind of an area that does require some custom development, especially as we start to realize the power of crowdsourcing more and more. And to Matthew's point, like, it's first to market. It's not best technology. It's whatever is stable enough to get used. I think to your point about Airbnb, that's a tricky line to walk because housing is very different than, say, bringing somebody diapers. And Airbnb, does have to hold up under scrutiny to that equity question of, are we reaching everybody equally and with an even hand? And, these are the types of questions that we're not even asking ourselves until, all these companies want to be so generous. So while I don't mean to say anything bad about that generosity. I think that there's laser targeted ways that it can be used. For example, Lyft Lyft just started operating in Houston again, and they donated $25,000 worth of rides to get people to their medical appointments and to help deliver food. So for these organizations, these grassroots organizations, Lyft would come in and say, hey, we'll be your delivery arm for you. And I thought that that was a particularly impactful way of using their services.
Yeah, I agree with Jeff was saying. I would add that there's no reason why new software startups can't be thinking about use cases like this when they design the software. It's hard just because, when you get funding, you're just kind of like focused on your goal and your milestone, just focus on that and nothing else. But if you think about the developers that are helping develop a lot of these platforms, when they go back to their day jobs, they are working at a lot of these companies. So they can be thinking about those feature sets and thinking, well, the next time something happens like this, can the next Uber or Lyft or whatever else comes after them build a feature that allows flash signups for people with boats or cars or helicopters or whatever you might need for that specific purpose, in exchange for social currency, in exchange for people's gratitude that this company really stepped up and helped us, right? That's the trade-off that they have to make.
So I have a comment that will morph into a question, but one thing that was new this time around was that Airbnb, even though they've had a disaster response program for a while, this was the first time they sent corporate people on the ground. And they actually had a table at NRG Center helping people get signed up for housing and working out the kinks in the system, because it was, I think, the largest disaster that they've had to handle with housing, and also the first time they sent people on the ground. And it would be good if other organizations did that. And another kind of missed opportunity that I saw was Facebook and their safety check. So in addition to doing the safety check, Facebook also gave you the option of, if you have a service or resource that you can donate, or do you need something? And a lot of people inputted that information, but Facebook never provided an interface to match the needs and the provisions. So for example, there were over 900 people that on the Facebook safety section said that they had housing that they could provide, but there was no way for folks that needed that housing to get access to it apart from just private messaging that person, which is very risky. There was no way that Facebook could forward those things to Airbnb or forward the donation needs to the I have food, I need food app or whatever else. So I wish Facebook had more direct role like Airbnb did to actually send folks from corporate on the ground to witness the emergency firsthand and facilitate a better matchup of the needs and provisions. So I don't know how we can encourage that.
So a couple of thoughts on that. One is that I'm not on Facebook at all. I did a big data project a while back and saw how creepy and how much data they collect. So this would be my spiel. If you're on Facebook and you use it, I can tell exactly how you voted better than your wife can based off of data. So think about that as you use that. But I'll get off of my Facebook high horse and move on to, there was actually a study that I saw that talked about how that Facebook safe checker actually causes more problems than it solves, because a lot of people just don't say that they're safe, because why not? I'm on here, I'm posting a picture of my puppy or whatever, and then it causes people to panic because they didn't mark themselves as safe. And so it turns into this big, well, now I've got to reach out, and now I think that this person's lost, and now I'm reporting that they're lost just because they didn't mark themselves as safe and they haven't posted in a while. So the jury's kind of still out on whether or not that thing actually works. Has it even saved a single life? Or what happens because not everybody uses it, you can't determine that somebody who hasn't marked themselves as safe is, in fact, not safe, the opposite of that. So I also think I want to point out that sometimes these things that we roll out because they don't really think through the end result. And if you think about it, that makes sense because Facebook just wants to generate more posts and more data and more engagement. So we have to now start paying attention to what is the mission statement of these companies, and does that even align with making the world a better place or saving people? And with Facebook, it's not. So with Airbnb, there's a little bit different. They probably have a mission statement within their company to help provide equal housing and help, do this kind of stuff. I don't exactly know what it is, but it actually probably falls really in line with what would happen with a bunch of displaced people inside of a city. So you can almost trust them a little bit more because they're not in business to sell your data to governments or to whatever they're doing with it. They're in the business of providing housing. So I think as people come in, what's your motivation? When we talk to Zendesk, who their whole mission's probably something along the lines of providing great support and communications. Great, yeah, absolutely, come in. You're in line with what we're trying to do. Airbnb, same thing. Lyft, same thing. So I think it's super important to go, do we really want Facebook coming in and solving our problems? Do we really want them dragnetting all of our data when we're in a very vulnerable moment? And should they be the savior, or should people on the ground do that?
So it sounds like one element of your question is this idea of trust. I had a conversation with Elena White, and she asked, why do you think that you and Michael were able to do a lot of stuff that we did through Station during Harvey? And I said it was because of trust. It's because of the relationships that you had, that you could call up anybody and say, you know what, we need access to the mayor. We need access to, Google. And people would actually listen. I had reached out to Twitter during Harvey because that one place of truth, knowing who to trust, who was actually vetting the information that they were sharing, was a challenge. So I was asking them to get verified accounts. But this goes to why it's really hard to work with corporates, because they also have channels within their organization, and they have to vet, is this person trustworthy? Like, can I say, okay, we're going to click on that little blue button on all these accounts that they're sending over to us. So there's a challenge with working with corporates. If we can start developing, if we're planning for the next one, maybe we start developing those relationships now, and then verifying who are the trusted people within the community, so that whenever this happens again, we know, okay, well, at least we can trust these people on the platform right now to help coordinate some people and coordinate technologists together to solve the next challenge.
The Entrepreneurs for Houston effort, part of that, at least initially, as I understood, that would help maybe to provide some support to sustaining the efforts that all of you have been working on. I'm just curious where that is and what you're hearing, and might that be a vehicle to help, provide monetary support at the least, right? So we can pay some folks outside their day jobs if they wanted to help keep this up, and so that it doesn't get stale, and then the next time, you've got it going, and you can make small changes, but it's still viable.
Thank you for asking that. So for anybody who's not familiar with Entrepreneurs for Houston, it was a fund that was launched underneath the mayor's Hurricane Harvey Relief Fund to provide support to entrepreneurs who are addressing some of the challenges of Harvey. The best person to actually answer that question is Elena White, who is in the back. Elena, do you have...
Sure, yeah. Hi, guys. I haven't met you yet. I hope to meet you soon. Elena White. So as Grace was just saying, Entrepreneurs for Houston was born out of these efforts. Grace, Michael, Jeff, those sitting on this panel, and thousands of others contributed, obviously, to building a bunch of rapid response applications. And a couple of people, including some of those on this panel, said, how do we continue these efforts moving forward? How do we direct all of this energy to the highest priority needs, as Matthew was talking about, building out more of a needs assessment, and then how do we continue to fund these efforts? So so my background is in management consulting. I was just working for a software company servicing nonprofits and government in Austin, and was really interested, as soon as Harvey hit, was interested in this intersection of disaster recovery and technology, and started meeting these folks, and as of today, I'm the executive director of Entrepreneurs for Houston. So,
Congratulations.
thank you. I'm excited. So, of course, the fund was put together in the immediate aftermath of Harvey. Haven't had anybody staffed on it for the last month. I've been helping kind of perspective, we got to continue to raise funds, right? Can't do anything without that monetary backing. And then we need to build out a needs assessment for what the highest priority needs are and codify some of these learnings. Both, I think, looking back, but also looking forward, and be building out those right relationships with critical stakeholder groups at the city, also in the social services ecosystem, in order to build some of that trust and make sure that we're building right tools. So I look forward to working with all of you guys. Hopefully, if I haven't met you yet, I can do that for this.
Thanks, Elena. And then Jesse, you had a question?
Yeah, so first, thank you all for all the work that y'all did. I'm Jesse Bounds with the Mayor's Office of Innovation, and work hand in hand with each one of you, during the storm. One of the things I wanted to get your thoughts on, the Houston Chronicle, their lessons learned editorial the week after Harvey said that one of the pressing needs was to have like a 911 for an online, everything you need to know about emergency response. And that's kind of all the gaps that each one of these solutions was serving, was coordinating all of the different government communication arms and also the peer-to-peer stuff in a way that you know exactly where to go to. So everyone knows down to 10-year-olds that you call 911 if you need service. We've got 4 different websites for emergency response in Houston alone, government pages, not to mention all the other websites. So the single source of truth, but they were suggesting that it come at a federal level because of that layered level of information. And 911 is managed by the federal government, but you call it from Katy and it goes to 911. You call it from Houston, it goes to 911. But it's at the federal level managed. And so I guess want to get your thoughts on what, on that, if there's a need for a unified 911 emergency response, and also to what extent, or y'all did a lot with relief, y'all did a lot with response. There's some ongoing needs, and there will be ongoing needs for the next 2 to 5 years, Harvey related. If we're packaging up a solution, what's the bounds of that solution? Obviously it's all the immediate relief type of stuff, but at what point does it just stop being emergency response and start being social services, ongoing social service type of stuff?
I'd like to take a first stab at the 911 question. So the question is, do we need a universal 911 so that the entire region is kind of unified in the rescue and relief efforts? So it's not just if you're calling from Katy or if you're calling from Houston that it goes to 911, but that, I guess it goes into one unified effort, for rescue. What we heard was that 911 was getting overwhelmed. And then 311 was getting overwhelmed because they weren't getting through to 911. So I don't think having this one place that people are expecting someone to answer the phone and answer their questions is probably the best thing. It could be a system like you answer these 3 questions and it will triage you to the appropriate response person. It could be another type of solution. But I think the having the one place where 2 million to 6 million people are trying to call in is not necessarily the best solution.
Yeah, I agree. I think that, well, first of all, the federal government has tremendous resources to deploy at a problem like this. They have U.S. Digital Service, they have 18F, they have incredibly talented developers, designers, consultants who can build a really great thing if that's where the president decides that he wants to spend money. But that being said, I think what this disaster taught us is that everybody's got ideas about what the app should be or what the platform should be. But what's most critical is that the data is accurate more than anything else. And if we make sure to focus on a problem like that, a problem that we know to be an issue, and there's a lot of problems like that, then I think that it will yield whatever the solution yields. It'll be fine, because if you're using 15 different maps for rescue, as long as they're all showing the same information in real time, who cares? I'll use this one for an iPhone, I'll use this one for an Android, I'll use this one on my Apple IIe. Like, to me, it doesn't matter, and that's my opinion. But I think that more than anything else, again, this is a niche focus, and so I would be surprised if the federal government was able to pull off something that would be effective and useful in the next disaster, because it would take so long to build. And I think that these community efforts help inform what an eventual software product may look like, or series of products.
So to expand on that a little bit, data is always collected and then provides a telling indicator on how effective things are. So there's the response, there's the data that's collected off of it, and it's important to then use it to morph the next solution and then collect the data again to see how effective we were. But here's a real issue. We already have an indicator. 911 got overridden with phone calls and was unable to be used. You already know then that everybody's initial knee-jerk reaction to being flooded is to dial 911. So the problem is we go build a second application. And let's just say that it's the greatest thing ever. It uses Apple's new bar and it scans your face and it just solves your problem somehow. I don't know how, but it blows the floodwater out and you're fine. It won't matter if people don't use it. So it doesn't matter how good our solution is. We already know that what everybody does is call 911. So why don't we just start there with building the strategy? What is the very first person somebody does? What was the very first thing we did with our boat? We sat around for about an hour drinking beer trying to figure out how to get started and never really quite figured it out. So how does a person who's flooding get started? They dial 911. We've all been trained to that since we were in elementary school. Dial 911. It can be solved if you have the ability to go, there's a disaster in that area, deploy the extra 911 centers that are not in non-disaster areas and have all of them all start fielding calls as well. You actually could end up solving it. So I think that's why I can't echo enough with Entrepreneurs for Houston. Before we start deploying capital, before we start putting money into things, make sure the data is correct so that we can measure efficacy of the dollars that are deployed, so we don't waste people's money that went towards Harvey relief. And then secondarily, while it might not be the most ideal solution, if people are used to dialing 911, we can't ignore that fact. Even if all that happens is that I don't get a busy signal, I get a recording that says, due to the emergency stuff in your area, instead you're going to dial these prompts to go through this wizard. If that's the entry point that everybody's using, we have to start there. So really, I would love to be a part of, and I really think that that's what the community is a push for, is this strategic effort to determine where does the problem start, what do people do, the knee-jerk reaction, build this whole report, and then we can go back and look and see how to plug all the parts into that.
Yeah, I think, I look at what's already been done, right? So look at Amazon. I never call them. I put in a phone number, they call me, when they're available. So just building upon what these guys said, I don't think we need to invent another way of solving the problem. I think people are already trained to call 911 or 311, whatever it might be. It just needs to be made a lot more streamlined. And we have all of the machine learning and AI and every single, all this cool stuff you hear about available to us. We just need to make it a bit more effective.
Yeah, I think if you look back at, it was neighbors helping neighbors. Neighbors were first responders in this case. Finding a way to create a volunteer disaster department, right? So volunteer firefighters, so that you could maybe 911 triages, and then you activate the local volunteer disaster department, or the Bayou Navy, our version of the Cajun Navy, to go out in the field and start helping people. Yes.
Great.
Yes.
I just wanted to also respond to Jesse. I think, your second part of your question is about, rebuilding really takes years, and so we can look back, but also what we can be looking forward. And I definitely think that, and I said this, those of y'all who were here this morning, Harvey revealed infrastructure challenges in our physical infrastructure and our drainage, and, but it also revealed infrastructure challenges in our social networks, infrastructure challenges in our social services organizations, technical infrastructure challenges.
So with that, I want to thank our panelists for joining us today. Everyone, can you help me? The round of applause. Thank you for joining us. And next we have a happy hour, light happy hour. So speaking of beers and boats, if anybody wants to grab a beer, we have them in the kitchen. And we have our last panel of the day at 6 with Great Grocery and We Crowd Capital. Thank you.